The State Department mandates now that if a visa officer is inclined to approve a student in the application, in the interview, before they can approve that visa, they have to review that student's entire online presence. Well, you may have just made a mistake. It may be an honest mistake, but visa officers are now instructed to take any discrepancies as a sign of a lack of credibility. And that alone can lead to a denial. When I was an officer in Beijing, I approved an applicant who had been refused 9 times before. Now, this is not normal, right? This is an edge case. But just because you've been refused several times doesn't necessarily mean you are always going to be refused. As a visa officer, you are not supposed to rely on documents to make a decision. There's an assumption, first of all, that anything that an applicant brings on a piece of paper could be fake. Decades ago, we determined that the best way to evaluate whether somebody is qualified for a visa is to talk to them face to face and evaluate how they explain themselves, how they, introduce their qualifications. There's no magic number that you need to meet for finances. You just need to show that you've got arrangements in place to cover the total expenses that are listed on your I-20 form. Universities want you in this country. We value your presence on our campuses, the diversity that you bring to our discussions, to the way you solve problems.
Today, we're tackling a topic that keeps a lot of international MBA applicants up at night: visas. Yep, we're talking about I-20s, F-1s, and the entire alphabet soup of the American immigration process. We're going to break down the latest student visa rule changes, maybe demystify some of the interview process with someone who's been in the room, and give you practical tips for your visa journey so that it's as smooth as possible. Plus, we'll cover common pitfalls that trip people up and share insider advice from an experienced immigration attorney. So whether you're dialing in from Delhi, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, or right here in the United States, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's get you one step closer to your dream MBA. I'm Brian Phoebe, CEO of GuruFi.com, and my co-host today, as always, is Maria Wickvilla from ApplicantLab.com. And today we're joined by Travis Feuerbacher, who's an immigration attorney and former consular officer, so he knows all the ins and outs of the visa process. How are you doing today, Travis?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Travis, it's great to talk to you today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you come to this work?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by training, but shortly after I passed the bar exam, I had a couple of years of litigation experience. I decided to join the Foreign Service. So our foreign ministry, it's called the U.S. State Department. I had an initial introduction to the Foreign Service in university. I spent a summer as an intern at the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala, actually working with visa officers. And I thought it was fascinating. And so I decided to join. My first foreign assignment was in Beijing, China. And then I went to the northern part of Mexico in a city called Matamoros, where I worked in our consulate there. And for most of my time while I was abroad, I was a visa officer. So I interviewed tens of thousands of applicants from all over the world, seeking virtually every type of visa, including many students. And in the busy summer months, I would often interview 50, maybe up to 70 students a day. And I have to tell you, I loved it. Students bring their passion, their motivation. And most visa officers think like that. They enjoy interviewing students. So keep that in mind. It's a nice thing. I've trained visa officers. I've managed a fraud investigation team, which is responsible for investigating potential visa and passport fraud. I've even trained customs and border protection officials on the U.S. southern border on how to spot fraudulent birth certificates and other fraudulent documents. And so now, as a practicing immigration attorney, my focus is on helping applicants navigate through the murky and often even scary application and interview process. I help applicants understand how to avoid complications and how to, handle complications that maybe just aren't avoidable.
So 6 months ago, I think if we were to have done this episode, we would have gotten a lot of I don't know or we'll sees to a lot of the questions that we're going to ask today. We're hearing a lot about the changes to the American student visa rules. Can you maybe walk us through some of the updates and which of them you think matter the most for prospective MBA students?
Yeah, so there have been many updates, and I think when you look at each of them sort of in a vacuum, they're maybe not that impactful, right? But when you take them all together, there have been some pretty profound changes. But Brian, before I jump into this, I think it's important to mention that generally speaking, we still are welcoming students to the United States. I think especially when you're outside of the country, when you're watching the media, the news reports, this is kind of a scary situation. But I often tell my clients, I tell universities, I tell incoming international students that the vast majority of Americans want you in this country. Universities want you in this country. We value your presence on our campuses, the diversity that you bring to our discussions, to the way you solve problems. And I think it's a testament to the fact that there are organizations like GMAT Club. There are teams of international student advisors at the schools that you're applying to. They're all here to support you. So keep that in mind. And I'm very hopeful that you are successful throughout the journey. But yes, there have been a lot of changes. And so if we go back about 6 months ago, Brian, you're totally correct that basically any question you asked me, I would have answered with, I'm not really sure, but here's how it might play out. Well, now we know more about how it's playing out because a lot of the dust is starting to settle and we're starting to kind of see how things are going. So, in the beginning of the summer, there was a bombshell that student visa interviews were paused. This is, it sounds cliche to say this, but this was unprecedented. This happened right in the beginning of the busy summer application season when many international students were hoping to secure a student visa for that fall intake. Thankfully, the applications were resumed, but there was a backlog that I think we still see today. And many students found it difficult to schedule interviews because, the schedules were filling up. So, in the wake of that pause, we started seeing a new kind of process playing out to apply for visas. So, the process, generally speaking, is largely the same. You start by getting your I-20 form from the university, from the school that you plan to attend. Make sure everything on the I-20 form is accurate. The way your name is spelled, your date of birth, the major that you are, the degree you're seeking, your major, your course of study, the program start date, the cost. If anything doesn't look accurate, your school should be able to easily revise the I-20 form and then send you a new one. Once you get that form, your journey begins. That's when you start by going online and filling out an online application form that we call the DS-160. That hasn't changed. But one of the questions in that form is now more important and actually more crucial than it ever has been. And that is, have you used any social media platforms in the last 5 years, or are you still using those social media platforms? And this is tied to that pause in visa applications earlier this summer. The State Department mandates now that if a visa officer is inclined to approve a student in the application, in the interview, before they can approve that visa, they have to review that student's entire online presence. And that begins with how you fill out the DS-160. So first of all, if you leave off even one social media platform from that form, your application is likely to be denied. At the very least, you're probably going to encounter longer delays. So to start, you have to mention everything on that form. And I always tell people, fill the form out yourself. Don't put this in the hands of somebody else that may not be quite as scrupulous as you are, because details matter. After you fill that form out and you schedule your interview, then like I said, if the visa officer is inclined to approve you, they have to essentially put your application on pause before they can approve your visa while they review your online presence. And this is a big change because they are looking at lots of things. First of all, they're looking at details that might be a little bit scary. And hopefully this doesn't apply to anybody watching this. Things like potential support for an international terror organization, or evidence that you have or you're planning to violate the law. Think photos of you doing drugs or something. But beyond that, they're also looking for things that may seem more trivial. So, one of the issues that I've seen kind of complicate many of my clients' lives is a date or a detail on a LinkedIn profile that doesn't exactly match the DS-160. So, for example, let's say that in your LinkedIn profile, you say that you started a job on February 1st, but in your DS-160, you say that you started that job 3 months earlier. Well, you may have just made a mistake. It may be an honest mistake. It may be a typo. But visa officers are now instructed to take any discrepancies as a sign of a lack of credibility. And that alone can lead to a denial. And so I don't say this to scare anybody. This is really just kind of a bureaucratic step in the process. It's not something that you should be scared about, but it is important that you take some time and make sure that everything is accurate and honest and complete. So beyond this new mandatory social media review requirement, there's a couple of other changes that are affecting the process in general. One of which is a reduction in the validity period of student visas for citizens of several countries. So, for example, if you're a citizen of Ghana, you should expect that your student visa will only be valid for 3 months. And what that means is you can only really schedule your visa interview within that 3-month window before your program starts. Because once your visa is approved, that's the window of opportunity you have to use that ticket into the United States. Once the visa is expired, you can't travel with it. And so generally speaking, I tell students to start this process as early as possible. You can generally get a student visa up to 1 year before your program starts, as listed on your I-20 form. But if you're a citizen of a country where you would get a limited validity visa, that 1 year window is now shortened. It's now condensed. And so it's another complication, another factor that you have to consider as you go through the process. And then finally, another major change, and this was a little weird because it was announced on a Saturday, which is not normal for the State Department, but that is that anybody seeking a non-immigrant visa, and so of course this includes F visas, J visas, anybody seeking a non-immigrant visa is limited to scheduling their interview in their home country or their country of residence. And that means that you're no longer able to travel outside of your country to schedule an interview. And I think that's going to affect people predominantly from countries that have, backlogs. So India is a good example. If you're seeing a wait time before you can schedule an interview of several months, maybe pushing it beyond that start of class, you can't go to another country. And so your only option then is to schedule an interview, even if it's out a year from now, and then request an earlier appointment slot, sometimes called an emergency or an expedited interview appointment, which may or may not be granted. And so that's a big stressor right there. And it's another reason to start the process as early as possible. And then finally, and I know that these are a lot of changes. I mentioned that there were a lot. We've seen a change to what we call the interview waiver program, or what we call internally in the State Department, the Dropbox program. So previously, if you had a visa that was either still valid or had expired within 48 months, if you met a couple of other criteria, you could renew that visa without coming in for another interview. Well, that has all but been eliminated. There's a couple of exceptions that have been carved out, but for most applicants, for most foreign citizens, you now must schedule a new interview even if you are renewing a previously valid visa. And while that might not directly affect a student, that means that more people are going to go into this funnel to schedule a visa interview, which means, less bandwidth for each of you to schedule your interview. So, a couple of scary things here, but in the background of all of this, what I think is really important to keep in mind is that consular officer training has not changed. The culture of consular officers has not changed. I stay in touch with many of my former colleagues. I even met several of them at a couple of embassies over the summer in Asia. They're the same as they ever were. And so I don't expect, despite what you're probably reading online, I don't expect that you're going to have a profoundly more difficult path. The difficulties are purely bureaucratic at this point. It's maybe harder to schedule an interview. It's going to take longer after your interview to be approved because of all these mandatory reviews that I was discussing. But at the end of the day, consular officers, visa officers are evaluating your qualifications just like they always have. And so try not to let this discourage you from coming to the country. It was a long-winded answer, Brian, but I hope I responded to your question there.
Yeah, there's so much there. And before I turn it over to Marie, can I ask you one quick follow-up question? Because when I did an event for GMAT Club a couple months ago, this was the thing that people asked me about a lot, and I didn't have any sense of what the answer would be. The social media part. So if I could kind of divide it into two parts, there's like the clean it up technical stuff, which is make your dates align. All right. That seems straightforward. But one thing that people ask me about is like, well, let's say I have, without getting into the weeds politically, a post that the current administration would not like about a subject that is not patently illegal, like terrorism, right? So the person just doesn't like Trump and they have something on whatever, their Snapchat, their TikTok, whatever. Mm-hmm. Is it advisable to simply delete that and clean everything up? Or is that in itself a red flag? I mean, how much monitoring or how much adjustment should people do? Or is that something that in itself, like if your social media is a little too clean, right? It's all just, you visiting old folks' homes and playing with your puppy. Like, is there a sense that those things can themselves be red flags? Or I guess the short of the question is, what should people do to get their social media to a place where it's acceptable? Or should they just simply leave it how it is?
It's a really good question, Brian. I think, well, first of all, I have still yet to tell anybody to advise any client to delete anything. It rubs me the wrong way as a lawyer. It almost feels unethical to tell somebody to delete a post because now they're almost presenting a face that's not truly accurate. And so I haven't gone that far. What I do advise people, though, is to, review your online presence before the interview. Make sure that there's nothing there that might, worry you if it maybe appeared on the front page of your national newspaper, for example. And I will say that, visa officers are reviewing this. And quite often they are flagging things that they see and they're talking with their peers. They're talking with their managers. That's why this process can take several days, even a couple weeks, is because this is a pretty in-depth review. And I've heard anecdotally of posts that may even be satirical or memes that have risen to the level of maybe leading to a denial. Posts that are maybe commenting about the state of politics in the United States or the Trump administration. And so you should be aware of it. But again, I have not told anybody to delete anything. And yeah, Brian, you're right. That could be a red flag in and of itself. I was working with a student a couple weeks ago who has a few social media accounts, but they don't use them. They've got a YouTube account, a Facebook account. They never post anything. They never watch anything. And the visa officer asked them about that in the interview. You've got these accounts. You really don't use them? And, the applicant was able to explain, I don't really like social media. I have these accounts to kind of keep up with a few things, but I don't post anything. And that was the honest answer. And I think, the honesty in that response really came through. And above all else, visa officers value credibility. They value honesty, transparency. So I would rather somebody just lay their cards on the table, as we would say in the United States. Just be who you are, be honest about it, and you're probably in a better place than if you tried to, somehow curate your online persona for a visa.
Yeah, Travis, I actually have some follow-up questions about this topic as well. Is there any sort of rumor or speculation that, for example, let's say I have more than one social media account. Let's say I've got my one Facebook account that I have several hundred sort of strangers, quasi acquaintances on, and then I've also got like a smaller, like, is there a way for them to, for example, discover that I have more than one account if I only divulge one of them? Or as another example, is there a way for them to find out if I do delete that one post that I made 2 years ago that I now realize in retrospect is super problematic? Like, I understand not fully sanitizing it because then it's going to look pretty fake. But if you've got one or two posts that were really bad from a consular perspective, is there a way for them to tell? Because I think that there's some paranoia around, I don't know, that there's some sort of AI that's being implemented. Have you heard anything like that, or is that just a rumor?
Well, first of all, just to be very clear, I don't know. I'm not privy to the inner workings. This is confidential, classified stuff. I'm no longer a member of the Foreign Service, so I honestly don't know. What I tell my clients, though, and this is throughout the process, you should just assume that your visa officer knows everything about you. Now, they certainly don't. That's ludicrous, and it's not true. But there are always a couple of things in anybody's life that maybe you're less than proud of, right? You're maybe thinking, well, if they find this out, it's going to look bad. And this can be a social media account that maybe you don't want to list. It could be a social media account that you've deleted. It could be the fact that you have a relative in the United States, or that somebody applied for a green card in your name 20 years ago, or you were arrested for something in a different country, even though charges were dropped. All these little details, you should assume that your visa officer knows the truth. And then the only option is just tell the truth. Just put it out there. Maria, I assume that the State Department has a way of maybe pulling up deleted posts, maybe finding accounts that were deleted. I don't know if that's true, but I assume it is. I mean, it seems like they probably could figure this out. And so, it's better to just be your true self than to try to present an image that you think the officer wants to hear. And one last thought here. One of the most common questions that I'm asked, especially by students, is how should I explain my finances? What does my officer want to hear? And my answer is, what is your what are your arrangements? What is the honest situation? Well, that's what you should explain. Don't ask what your officer wants to hear. Challenge yourself to just be honest. Because officers, they're not human lie detectors, but they, after thousands of interviews, they're pretty adept at sussing out the less than credible answers from the credible answers. And so just be who you are, and you're in a much better position for success.
Yeah, so this is great. So first of all, I think the first sort of actionable tip that we can share with applicants, anyone who might be in the application process right now, is maybe you haven't been thoughtful in the past about your social media posting, but maybe now is the time to start. And then touching upon the finances. So let's take a step back for people who might not know the process. So I get accepted. I set up my appointment for my interview. Prior to setting up that appointment with the interviewer, prior to having the interview, what other documentation do I need to send over, if any, in order to make that interview? Do I need to send over, for example, bank accounts, I don't know, pay stubs? Is there any value if maybe my personal bank account is not very impressive, but maybe I have a family member somehow who has a lot, like sort of from a sort of taking a step back, like what is it that I'm going to need when I show up to that appointment? And then we can dig into, well, now that we know what we need, what do we think about like what's good versus bad in terms of things like how much money we have?
There's a couple of things there, Maria. It's a really good question. First of all, let me kind of clarify a false rumor that was circulating pretty widely over the summer. And that is that you have to upload documents before you schedule the interview. That is completely not true. And in fact, there's no way to upload documents before you schedule the interview, or even before the interview itself, at least for students. That's different if you're looking for a green card and a couple other types of visas. This is something, I think there was a YouTube video that kind of went viral, and even some immigration attorneys were reporting this new change. It's not true. So don't believe that. The only thing you do before you schedule the interview is you fill out the DS-160 form, you submit it, you schedule the interview, and you show up with your I-20 form, your passport, and a couple of documents. So documents in general. I've trained visa officers in my career. I've been trained as a visa officer in my career, and it is unanimous. It's in every form of training. You are not, as a visa officer, you are not supposed to rely on documents to make a decision. There's an assumption, first of all, that anything that an applicant brings on a piece of paper could be fake. And if we think about the reason, the rationale for this in-person interview requirement that the United States has in the first place, it's because decades ago, we determined that the best way to evaluate whether somebody is qualified for a visa is to talk to them face to face and evaluate how they explain themselves, how they, introduce their qualifications. And so one thing that a lot of applicants will do is, first of all, they're rejected. They come to me and they say, but the visa officer wouldn't look at any documents. And I say, yeah, I'm sorry, but that's how the process works. Or you'll see an applicant who goes to the interview, and I experience this all the time as an officer. They show up to an interview with a very disheveled pile of papers. It's all kind of mismatched, and they shove it in the little tray under the window. And that's how they try to answer a question. So how do you plan to pay for this program? Oh, I've got all of this. Let me give you this. Well, that's just going to, incentivize an officer to say, no, stop, get that out of here. The officer wants to evaluate how you explain verbally, whether you're qualified. That said, there are some documents that are often helpful. One of which would be some form of proof of the arrangements that you've made to pay for your tuition and your other expenses. This is very nuanced, it's very case by case, but generally speaking, think about bringing bank statements, either your own bank statements or from the person or people who will be sponsoring you. Think about bringing student loan documents, a proof of a scholarship if you've gotten a scholarship. And this should go without saying, but I feel the need to say it. Please don't bring anything that's fake. Even if you just change a number on a statement, it really, and this is honest, one of the reasons that I've dedicated my life to helping visa applicants through this journey is because I saw far too many times an applicant that truly appeared to be qualified, but they acted on really bad advice from somebody, and they brought a fake bank statement, or they lied about their salary or their tenure at a company. Please don't do that. Please be honest. There's no magic number that you need to meet for finances. You just need to show that you've got arrangements in place to cover the total expenses that are listed on your I-20 form.
Yeah, that's another sort of stereotype or a rumor of, okay, so right off the bat, let's say they work for a nonprofit in a developing nation. They themselves don't have a lot of money, but they got accepted and they did get a student loan to cover the full amount, but their own bank account only has a few $100s in it. Would they get denied based on their non-student, if we take the student loan out of the picture, looking just at their individual financial situation, would that be a cause for a denial? And sort of an add-on to that, like what if the individual doesn't have a lot of money, but they have a wealthy uncle or a grandmother or something that is willing to pay or to support them financially? Or do those things come into play ever?
Absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, this is all case by case, but generally speaking, not having a lot of money shouldn't be a disqualifying factor if you've got a scholarship. Again, the visa officer who interviews you is simply looking at, do you have enough money? Is there a pile of money somewhere that's going to cover the expenses on your I-20 form? Students often ask me, okay, my program is going to cost, let's say, $100,000. Uh, do I need $150,000 to get the visa? Absolutely not. You need to show that you have $100,000 somehow arranged to pay these expenses, and that's it. I will say though, and this is a little bit kind of in line with your question, Maria. Uh, there is more scrutiny now, it seems like, than there used to be over student loans. And I think that it's a little bit unfair, but I do understand it. I tell students that in the United States, it's very common for us to go to school, whether it's, university, graduate school, with the aid of student loans. Like, I couldn't have gone to law school if student loans weren't a thing. But visa officers are concerned about how you plan to repay the loan, especially if you're maybe planning to go back to a low paying nonprofit job, or you're going to a country with maybe kind of a lower average income rate. Uh, I think it's maybe unfair, but it is justified because officers want to make sure that when you use that ticket, that student visa to get into the country, you're not going to violate our visa regulations. If you run out of money or you don't have enough money to pay your expenses, you may have to find a job without authorization. And if an officer has a reason to think that might happen, they can't approve the visa. Or, maybe you're really not going back home after you graduate because you've got this mountain of student loan debt, and you can only repay that if, again, you work in the United States without authorization or you do something else. So be prepared to explain exactly what you plan to do after you graduate, with kind of an eye towards how are you going to repay back the debt that you've accrued to get this degree.
So I know that in the United States, it's not been as big of a problem as in countries like Canada or the UK, the issue of like these diploma mills. But you do encounter a lot of questions, or I encounter a lot of questions about how the status or credibility of a school might impact the visa process. The idea being that, like, if you're going to go to Wharton, it's almost pro forma. But if you're going to, Southwest Jesus Tech in Starkville, Mississippi, then it's a bigger hill to climb. Either, anecdotally or psychologically, or if there are actual policies for this. Does that actually end up being the case, that the type of or status of the school will impact the difficulty of getting a visa?
It's a really good question, and it's a common question that students ask me. And the short answer is no. The Foreign Affairs Manual, or FAM for short, which is basically the instruction book for visa officers. It instructs them how to do their job. It specifically says the student's choice of school or degree program is far less important than how they explain their motivations and their plans and their situation at home. And that is true. Officers generally don't really care where you're going to school or what you will study, as long as you can explain your decisions and your plans and your motivations and your financial arrangements. Now, there is a kind of nuanced, maybe exception to what I just said, though. And so think about your choice of school on kind of a spectrum. On one end, there's an Ivy League school, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. And, these are schools that accept almost nobody. I don't know what the acceptance rate is at the schools, but they go through an extensive vetting and due diligence process, right? So if I encountered an applicant going to Yale University, I had very little to worry about. This is probably somebody who is definitely going to study in the United States. Now, I'm still going to evaluate their financial arrangements and whether or not they're going to leave the country after they graduate, both important requirements, but I'm not really worried that they're a credible student, right? But on the other end of the spectrum, if I encountered a student that was going to a community college, Travis College in whatever town, and this community college essentially accepts anybody who enrolls in class, that's not a disqualification. Let me be very clear. But I know that the college hasn't really vetted the student, so I need to do a little bit more. I need to go into a little bit more detail. And that's where I'm going to be a little bit more interested in, are you actually planning to enroll in a full course load, attend class, graduate from your program? Because Travis College hasn't really ever looked into your situation. So again, it is a bit of a spectrum, but it's not that big of a deal.
So you've mentioned a little bit about the importance of narrative, right? They're going to ask you about your plans. Why are you studying this degree? Why are you coming? When you talk about your career plans for after graduation, does it matter if you say like, yes, I plan on staying for the full, amount of time that I'm allowed to under the OPT, and then after that, I'm going to go home? Or if your goal is in fact to become eventually a permanent resident of the US, should you perhaps avoid disclosing that? Because there's another rumor, there's so many rumors, but another rumor that has been floating around out there is that if you say, well, yeah, my plan is to immigrate to the US and eventually become a citizen, that actually might not be looked upon kindly, that there's this idea of there's like ties to your home country that they're looking for that shows that like, yes, you're just going away for a few years, but then you're always going to come back. There's enough to bring you back, a sort of a center of gravity to bring you back home. So is that true, first of all, in general? And then second of all, if so, then if you're asked during the interview, so what are your plans career-wise or after you graduate, should you be strategic in what you disclose?
You should be strategic. But again, I'm never going to advise somebody to lie. You've got to be honest. You've got to maintain credibility. But here's kind of how I explain it. First of all, the law is pretty clear here. The law requires the visa officer to assume that the applicant does not qualify. Either they're not going to abide by the restrictions and regulations associated with the visa, or they are what is called an intending immigrant, meaning they're never going to leave the United States. And so it really is the applicant's responsibility to establish their qualifications. It's a little bit contrary to most laws in the United States because it's almost like you're guilty until you prove you're innocent, right? But that is how the process works. And that's why, first of all, Maria, there's a lot of rumors online where you shouldn't elaborate in your answers. You should give short, one-word responses. That is not good advice because remember, it is your responsibility as the applicant to demonstrate that you qualify. And so you mentioned a concept called ties to home. You do need to establish that you're not planning to remain in the United States indefinitely. You have to show that there's some compelling reason or reasons that you're going back home. The law actually says that you have to show that you maintain a residence that you have no intent of abandoning. And that doesn't mean that you have to own property. It just means that something's going to pull you back, right? And so while it may be your dream to maybe get an H-1B work visa, maybe eventually a green card and eventually a US passport. And by the way, I totally support that. I think it's crazy that we educate foreign citizens and kick them out of our country. But unfortunately, that's what the law says. So while that may be your ultimate dream, remember that there's a lot that has to fall in place for that to become reality. First of all, you got to find a job. Then you've got to make it through for most types of professions. You've got to make it through the H-1B lottery. You've got to, apply for another type of visa. You may have to apply for a green card. There's a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome throughout this process. And at any step of the way, the door may close. And so what I tell my clients to think about is, what if that door is shut? What if you have no opportunity in the United States? What would you then do outside of the country? And that's what I want you to talk about at the interview. But again, don't lie. Don't say, after I graduate, I'm going to work as a director of marketing at the Travis company in my hometown. If that's not really your plan, don't say that. But you might talk about what you're exploring and what's of interest to you after you graduate. Because, yeah, Maria, there is a bit of a red flag associated with somebody who says, well, after I graduate, I'm going to get a green card and I'm going to live in Los Angeles. That unfortunately disqualifies you from getting a student visa.
In terms of maintaining a residence, just sort of a technical point, can you put your parents or relatives' residence? Is
It's
that
not
good enough?
don't yeah, and this is confusing, right? Residence doesn't mean an address. It doesn't mean a house or an
Okay.
apartment or a flat. What it really means is, and this is going to sound silly, but if you were a tree and you've got roots in the ground, where are those roots in the ground? So, establishing ties to home can come in many different flavors. It could be, explaining your extensive family back at home, elderly parents that you care for. It could be job opportunities waiting for you after you graduate. I'm getting this MBA so that I can be promoted to a director at my company. It could be plans. After I complete this master's degree, I'm hoping to do this at this company. So residence doesn't really mean residence in this language. It really just means where's your home? Where are you rooted? Where are you going back to?
So one of the things that I think a lot of people are really afraid of is the interview itself. It can seem kind of unsettling. You've already given some tips, stay honest, don't rely on documents. Can you kind of take us inside the room, and as someone who has done this literally thousands of times, what is it that you care about? What is it that someone should care about themselves as an applicant? And what are the common pitfalls or mistakes that people might make that's going to trip them up?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to know that visa officers are not law enforcement personnel. Many countries, they are basically immigration officials. They wear bulletproof vests. They carry firearms. Visa officers from the United States, they look like normal people. They look like me. They wear ill-fitting bureaucratic suits and ties. Of course, they may be Asian, they may be black, they may be white. That's the United States, right? And I will say also that everybody who shows up to an interview, well, almost everybody, is going to be nervous. This is a major milestone, and this is not a formality, as you probably gathered from the rest of this discussion. It is important. And, as a visa officer, I found it really odd when somebody approached my window and they were totally at ease. Hey, what's happening? That seemed a little weird. Like, what, are you a sociopath? How is this not terrifying to you? So, don't beat yourself up if you're nervous. Practice kind of, a breathing exercise or whatever might help calm you down. Speak slowly, just make sure you're articulating what you want to say, and hopefully you'll be okay. But, red flag. Well, actually, first of all, what are officers looking for? How are they evaluating students? And this is important because I think in your preparations, and this is really, where I focus with most of my clients, in your preparations, you should keep the goalpost in mind. You should keep the goal, the end point in mind. And that is actually pretty simple. Officers are thinking about three criteria. Number one, are you actually going to use this ticket, this visa to get into the country to be a student? Are you going to enroll in a full course load, attend class, ultimately complete your program or graduate? Or are you going to try to do something else, like find a job and send money back home, or, stay up late partying and sleep on somebody's couch? Number two, have you made sufficient financial arrangements to pay for your expense, tuition, living expenses, etc.? And then number three, are you going to leave the United States when your status concludes? And so that means, you've got school, maybe OPT or STEM OPT, maybe even another degree after that. When you're done being a student, are you going to leave the United States? And that's it. But remember, the way the law is written, it's your responsibility as the applicant to demonstrate that you qualify. And that's where everybody's unique situation is different. That's, again, where my partner and I really focus on, helping people prioritize what they need to explain. But let me talk about some red flags. And I think the first one is very important. The first one would be somebody that appears robotic and like they're reciting a memorized speech. And this happens either because somebody has just said, say this and you'll be approved, or you've just practiced and rehearsed so many times that you're just kind of regurgitating what you've practiced. Either way, all that tells the officer is, I can't really trust anything this person's telling me because, it just could be somebody else's words, right? You've got to be credible. You've got to be authentic if you're going to succeed. So I do think it is a good idea to prepare, maybe even kind of practice and consider how you're going to introduce yourself. But every time you do so, change it a little bit. Don't say the same thing time and time again, because then you're going to show up to an interview and seem like a robot. Beyond that, another big red flag that I mentioned earlier is bringing any fake documents or trying to lie about something or maybe hide something in your past. Again, assume that your officer knows everything about you, because some of those more embarrassing details, they probably do know. And so it's better to just be forthcoming, explain what's going on, hit it, proactively, and you may actually be successful even still. And then beyond that, sorry, Maria, you were about to say something.
I was just going to say, taking a step back, like what are the interview questions that are asked? But you could also fit it. I thought you were done.
No, it's a good question, and there's a lot of videos on YouTube that say these are the questions. I would be very reluctant to follow that, and that's because officers can ask you anything they want. I used to ask a very random question if I saw a student who was just reciting something. I would say something like, "Hold on. What did you eat for breakfast this morning?" And it's just because I wanted to get them off of the robotic script so I could actually figure out who they were and evaluate whether I could approve them or not. So literally anything is fair game. The interview will generally start, not always, but generally start with a pretty specific question. Something like, what school are you going to? Or what will you study? But from there, it can go in any direction because the officer is in a lot of pressure, I would say, is on the officer to work quickly. I used to interview well over 100, sometimes 150 people a day when I was in China. And that meant that I had 60, 90, maybe 120 seconds per interview. And so I don't have time to chit chat. I love talking to people. If you didn't notice, I would love to really get to know you, but I don't have time. I'm looking at a sea of people standing behind you that I still have to talk to. And so it's hard to say what questions you're going to be asked because it could be anything. You might say something that trigger a concern, such as, wait a minute, do you really have enough money for this program? Or I'm a little bit, concerned that you're not actually planning to go to school, or it could be anything. And so the officer's probably going to interrupt you. They're probably going to interrupt you with maybe a bit of an aggressive or kind of negative question, because that's what their job is to do. Their job is to poke holes and think if there's anything they need to worry about, and then try to address those concerns. So it's really hard to say the questions that you're going to be asked without actually knowing more about your situation, your plans, the school you're going to, what you're going to study. So yeah, I wish I could give more details there.
But it literally is like you're standing. It almost sounds like you're at like here in the US when we get our driver's licenses. Like, are you called into an office and sitting down, or is it like you're standing and there's a line of people and there's only a couple of minutes to get?
It's really the latter. You're generally in a big room. And depending on where you go, there may be one or two bulletproof glass windows that you stand in front of and you talk to the officer. Or it could be like the embassy consulates in India or China, where there may be 30 windows and the room is huge, or anything in between. But generally, and this is important, you're probably going to be standing for up to a couple of hours straight. You may have to wait outside before you even make it inside. And that may mean standing in the cold, in the heat, in the rain. it's far from ideal. Trust me. And the State Department is constantly going through efforts to improve this experience, but it's far from ideal. And so make sure you arrive early, eat a good breakfast or lunch before you get there, wear comfortable shoes. There's always, bathroom facilities, and you're not in a jail cell by any means, but you should prepare for a long wait, probably on your feet. And then when you approach the window, you're going to be, seen and heard by potentially hundreds of other people around you. And that actually raises one other point that I like to remind applicants, which is visa officers take every applicant, every case completely separately. They look at your qualifications basically in a vacuum. And so while you're waiting in line, you're probably going to be put in a line of maybe 4 or 5, maybe up to 8 other people at a specific window. You might hear that officer at your window denying a lot of people. 5 people in a row before you get to the window may have been rejected. And trust me, I know it's hard to believe, but that does not reflect in any way upon your qualifications. So the best thing you can do is try to block out that noise and just remind yourself that you deserve the visa. And just think about how you're going to introduce yourself and your qualifications. And don't walk up to that window thinking, well, all these people were refused. This officer refuses everybody. I'm destined for failure. If you come in with that mindset, you might fail yourself, unfortunately.
So as a final question, can I ask you a two-part question, which is, one, when and why should someone think about hiring an immigration attorney to help them through this process? And second, if their application fails, what are the next steps for them?
So the first question is hard to answer because I think a lot of people simply don't need an immigration lawyer's help. I would actually hope that most people don't need an immigration lawyer's help. This is not, and I remind my clients all the time, this is not a calculus exam that you're preparing for. The only thing standing between you and approval is hopefully just how you introduce yourself. But that said, a lot of people are nervous about this, and justifiably so. So even if you don't have any complications in your situation, it's still a good idea not to leave it to chance. Given the additional hurdles on scheduling interviews that I walked through earlier, you may only have one opportunity to stand in front of a visa officer before your classes begin. And if you're denied, your only option might be to defer the start of your class by a semester or even a year. And that's not a great situation to be in. So, first and foremost, if you're interested in just understanding how the process works, somebody's candid evaluation of your qualifications and help kind of prioritizing what you should explain, talk to an immigration lawyer. But beyond that, if you have a complicated situation, and this could be multiple prior refusals or even a prior refusal because your record lives on your digital file forever. If you've ever had any criminal issue, you've been convicted of something, you've been arrested for something, even if you were never charged, even if your criminal record says that it's perfectly clean, if you've had any encounters with law enforcement, you really should talk to an immigration lawyer to understand how that might affect your journey and how to address that issue. If you have family in the United States, if you have a pending green card application in your name, that can tend to kind of erode the conclusion that you're going to leave the country because maybe you're trying to get in to live with your family or kind of circumvent the multi-year wait that the green card might carry. And so we often, help applicants with complications, but we also often work with applicants that just want to be prepared. But then to your second question, Brian, what happens, if you're refused? And this is really important. So at the interview, you should expect an answer, either congratulations, you're approved, or, I need to look at your social media before I can approve you, but that's still a pretty good sign. or sorry, I can't approve you. Now, there's a third option too, though, and that would be I need more time before I can make a decision. And that might mean, the officer needs some more documents from you, or they need, some more details from you. Maybe there's just a glitch in the computer system and they can't hit the approve button before the IT team sorts something out. But if you find that you are now going to be subject to a delay, what's commonly referred to as administrative processing, that is a time when you should definitely reach out to an immigration lawyer, because there may be a window of opportunity for us to do a number of things, depending on what happened, to maybe push you across the line, push your application across the line. And then the last thing I'll say is, if you're refused, that might be another opportunity to talk to an immigration lawyer to evaluate your options then. A visa officer will almost never explain their justification for a refusal. It's really frustrating, but that's how they're trained. And so, first of all, it's nice to get a perspective on what likely led to the refusal, and then some advice on how to move forward. Would it make sense to try to schedule another interview immediately? Should you wait, several months? Are you maybe destined for failure and maybe you shouldn't waste your money? And then there's a number of strategies that might be employed as you proceed. Note that there's no way to appeal a denial. A lot of people will ask us if they can, file a complaint or get more details. Unfortunately, there's not, but you might be able to reapply and be approved. And so that's another time to reach out to an immigration lawyer.
Sorry, I just want to double click, as they say. You just said you might want to talk to a lawyer to find out if you are destined to always get rejected. When someone is destined to get rejected, what are the main reasons that might occur for that, right? So it's one thing if you show up for the interview and you're a little bit vague about your plans, and so the officer gets a little bit of the heebie-jeebies. But is there anything that really does make someone essentially like, look, don't even waste your time, as you just said? And what are those things?
It could be, a million things. This is super, super case dependent, but a couple of examples. I was working with a student who, my initial advice was, yeah, you should reapply. You seem to be highly qualified. I'll help you prepare. And then when we went further into the weeds, I realized that this individual had lied about many things in several previous applications, and that was certainly going to come out in the next application. And so my advice was, look, I can't really tell you to move forward. This is you have a very rough path to ever being approved. On the other hand, though, when I was an officer in Beijing, I approved an applicant who had been refused 9 times before. Now, this is not normal, right? This is an edge case. But just because you've been refused several times doesn't necessarily mean you are always going to be refused. It means that you need to be really strategic. And as I think either George Foreman or Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, look, if you get punched in the face and you're denied at that interview, maybe it's time to take a step back and reevaluate your approach. Try something different. And maybe there is a path forward, but it's very much, case specific, dependent upon your unique situation. And I will tell you, people don't pay me to hear what they want to hear. I'm not going to tell somebody you've got a great chance of success if they don't. I don't think I would be doing my job if that was my response. So I do break hard news to people sometimes. It's not fun, but I think it's important.
Yeah, Brian and I can relate to that for sure on the admissions advice giving side.
Right.
So you're telling me my 1.7 GPA is not going to get me into Harvard?
Maybe not. Maybe try Travis College instead. Right?
Maybe I hear Travis College is accepting. All right. Well, thank you so much, Travis, for all of this. This was absolutely wonderful, incredibly eye-opening. And yeah, this is wonderful. Where can people find you if they want to reach out to you and get more information from you?
2 places. One is, I would say, send us an email. You can reach out to us at info@zfvisa.com. or you can visit my law firm's website, which is zfvisa.com. Give us a little bit of background about your situation, what you're kind of looking for. We can tell you, first of all, if we might be able to help and how. And if you're looking for something that maybe we don't support, we work with a massive community of other immigration lawyers. We often introduce people to a specialist, but we'll do our best to get you the help that you need.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.